To close tonight's rally, please welcome our final speaker, Socialist Party Deputy General Secretary, Hannah Sell.
Comrades, we hold socialism at more or less the same time every year. And there has never been a year when there's been nothing to discuss, when nothing has happened to the working class in the course of the previous 12 months. Always there has been more misery, more factories closing, more austerity, more cuts to public services being carried out. And even in the bleakest years, there has also always been workers fighting back against that misery. But there have been many years where the political developments might have been described as same old, same old. The same old capitalist politicians representing the 1%. The only change being a few less people voting because they cannot bring themselves to support any of the establishment politicians on offer. That era has now come to an end. The leader of one of the leaders of the Russian Revolution, Leon Trotsky, once described a revolution as the forcible entry of the masses onto the scene of history, into the realm of rulership over their own destiny. We are not yet living through revolution, and the masses have not entered the realm of rulership over their own destiny. That minority of US workers who expressed their fury and their anger by voting for a racist billionaire will find out that they have certainly not got rulership over their own destiny. But nonetheless, in country after country, almost a decade after the world economic crisis began, a crisis that in Britain has meant wages have fallen by more than 10% on average, across the world, working people have responded to that, and the parties and the politicians who the capitalist class have relied on to represent their interests have lost control or are losing control of the situation. In Britain, despite their best efforts, the capitalist class cannot get any of their candidates elected as leader of the Labour Party because of the repeated upsurge of anti-austerity workers and young people in defence of Jeremy Corbyn. And of course, the depth of anger in society was laid bare in the Brexit vote. People voted for all kinds of reasons on both sides of the EU referendum. But nonetheless, at base, millions of working class people went out and voted no in a class revolt against all the threats of the capitalist class, of hellfire and damnation and the economy collapsing and the world falling on their heads. Still, they went out and voted no and rebelled at the ballot box. We fought, and many of you here were involved in that struggle, for the building of a mass campaign for a socialist Brexit in the course of the EU referendum. A campaign in opposition to the official right-wing, racist, capitalist exit campaigns. We put the case that the EU is a bosses' club that propagates privatisation and attacks workers' rights, which calls for the continuation of the water tax in Ireland and no doubt wants to see Paul Murphy jailed, that stands for driving the people of Greece into the dirt. We stand in opposition to the EU and for a democratic socialist confederation of Europe. We stand for workers' solidarity, and it is essential that we show that, as Paul has called for, in building a movement to defend the Jobstown protesters who are facing court and potential imprisonment. We shouted as loud as we could, but for the mass, for millions, our socialist, internationalist exit campaign was not heard above the din of the nationalists and the racists that dominated the official campaigns on both sides. But when you next hear Labour right-wingers bleating about how working class people are racist for voting no. Let's remember, it wasn't just UKIP and the Tories whipping up racism. Just 48 hours before the referendum, they were pleading with David Cameron, make some more anti-migrant announcements, be harder against migrants, because if you are, maybe we will be able to pip it for Remain. The EU referendum could have been a very different campaign. Read Jeremy Corbyn's position on the EU back from the last referendum in '75 up until the moment he was elected leader of the Labour Party. He has had a correct and consistent position of opposing the EU as a boss's club. Unfortunately, one of the first demands that was made on him by the right wing is that they would resign if he didn't agree to campaign uncritically for Remain. But had he campaigned for a socialist Brexit, then the millions of people who voted Brexit to protest that all they've suffered under the Tories and New Labour, many of them could have been won to a socialist alternative. We have to argue that that mistake should not be made again. It is clear there is growing anger at capitalist politicians and their diet of misery. People are starting to look for an alternative. And there is nothing automatic that right-wing populism, that the racists are the only or the main gainers from that process. The left can gain, provided they fight for their case. We listen to endless reports from supposed left-wing journalists at the moment, looking for the lost chord, that somehow the left has to come up with some new ideas if it is possibly going to win over working class people. What they mean by new ideas are very, very old ideas. The idea that there is somehow progressive capitalism, and that is what we should be working with and towards. What Paul Mason has called a humane capitalism without austerity, which he believes is completely possible. The working class learnt that lesson long ago. Go back to why the Labour Party was founded. A century ago, working class people recognised that supposedly progressive capitalism, in the form of the Liberal Party, could not represent their interests. And that was why they had to fight for a party that stood for the working class and that fought for socialism. As if today's modern capitalism does not have all the problems and worse of what existed in the past. What is today's gig economy? If it is not the ultimate condemnation of capitalism, that new technology is used to send us back to the Victorian era, what's the difference fundamentally than queuing on the docks in the East End to try and get a day's work at the end of the 19th century, or sitting today waiting for your app to beep in the hope that you might get an hour or two's work delivering pizza, driving people, cleaning, and all of the other work that is organised in that way today. That is the reality of modern capitalism. And the reason that Jeremy has twice been elected by a landslide is because his supposedly old-fashioned answers are rightly seen as a step towards solving the very modern problems of poverty, of hunger, of homelessness, of unemployment that we face under capitalism today. But let's be clear, if the Labour left again try to conciliate with the capitalist politicians in their own party, and there are worrying signs in that direction which we have all seen, they will never be able to win the millions of workers who have turned away from Labour because they see it as one more party of the establishment and big business. Imagine now, never mind the referendum, imagine now if Jeremy Corbyn was to launch a clear, determined campaign for a socialist Brexit, to say that he would move a very different repeal bill in Parliament to that being moved by Theresa May, that would repeal all of the EU legislation that enshrines privatisation, that prevents state intervention, that attacks workers' rights, and called for a real taking back of control by taking control via democratic public ownership. If he was to fight for that kind of socialist Brexit, it would electrify the country. You would have the real possibility of a general election, the government falling, and Jeremy Corbyn coming to power as a left Labour leader. So our role is to support Jeremy Corbyn and the left to the hilt in their battle against the Blairites. But we're not cheerleaders. We don't leave it there. We campaign for them to go further, and we criticise when there are retreats, because we're not doing this for fun. There is a real opportunity here. The hundreds of thousands of people who have swung into action to support Jeremy Corbyn, that is a potential movement which, if consolidated, out of the ashes of New Labour, could create a mass party of the working class and the increasingly radicalised middle class in Britain. And we see in the US, in very stark terms, what happens, the consequences of wasting such opportunities by conciliating with corporate politicians like Hillary Clinton instead of taking a clear and determined stance. So we want to avoid those mistakes being made. And that does mean driving the Blairites out of their positions in the Labour Party. As Peter said yesterday, fighting for the immediate introduction of mandatory reselection. Of course, we're told by others on the left, you're being unnecessarily harsh. Don't be so over the top about this. It's not harsh. How can it be that a party founded by the trade unions, a party that now has an anti-austerity leadership, can have somebody like John McTernan, the man who ran Scotland's very successful Labour election campaign, but aside from that, has publicly said to the right-wing capitalist press that it is time for the Tories to crush the rail unions once and for all. And this man is in the ranks of the Labour Party. It is not harsh to say that we have had enough of decades where the Parliamentary Labour Party and council chambers up and down the country have been dominated by people who vote for privatisation, for cuts in benefits, for war, for tuition fees, and not a few of whom have fiddled their expenses, and do it without any consequences threatened against them. They do it with impunity, no fear of being deselected. And they still are. That's the issue. That hasn't changed. They cannot turn up to vote to a Labour motion to try and stop the selling of arms to Saudi Arabia that are being used to bomb innocent civilians in Yemen. And there are no consequences against them at this point in time. In our view, we have to fight for reselection, but we also should go further. The Labour leadership should go further and say, you're not welcome in our party anymore if you turn up and you vote for war and you vote for privatisation and you vote for benefit cuts and misery. If you vote for those things, you are no longer part of the Labour Party. You do not have the Labour whip. And yes, initially that would mean fewer MPs. But I tell you what, better to have fewer who are all actually on the same side, rather than having the big majority of them fighting for the opposite team, as is the case at the moment. And it would change. Look what's taken place in Spain. Look what has just been reported on Ireland. A clear anti-austerity Labour Party would quickly be able to make electoral gains. We get told that we don't care about winning elections. It's rubbish. We don't care about winning elections in order to do the bidding of the capitalist class. That's not taking power, and we would never do that. But we do care about winning elections in order to aid the struggles of the working class. Look what we were able to do when we played a leading role in Liverpool City Council, and let nobody tell you that was electorally unpopular. On the contrary, had the swing to Labour that took place in Liverpool in 1987 been repeated on a national scale, Labour would have won a landslide victory instead of the miserable defeat that Kinnock led the Labour Party to. And so we say, Jeremy Corbyn has a clear mandate, and now he needs to build on it to consolidate the victory. And if that isn't done, then unfortunately, eventually, Tom Watson's anaconda strategy to surround Jeremy Corbyn and to crush him will eventually work. The anaconda email, I know Watson's denied it, but, you know, who's betting that it isn't true? The anaconda email says quite clearly, we will take every concession made by JC and use it to tighten the grip. Learn the lessons, make no more concessions. And we would add, big as the pressure from the capitalist class is on Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour leadership at the moment, it is as nothing to the pressure that Labour would face if it was to win a general election with a left leadership. Just as in Greece, world capitalism did all it could to force Cyprus to bend the knee, the same pressure would come down on a Labour government. Does that mean we're in any way pessimistic? No. After all, had Cyprus shown the same determination as the Greek people when they voted no in the referendum, the outcome would have been very different. But it does mean it is necessary to be implacable, to mobilise popular support for your programme, and be prepared to stand up to, not compromise with the capitalist class inside or outside of your party. But also that a left-led government would face constant sabotage from the capitalist class, and that would pose the issue of implementing a socialist programme, of breaking with capitalism, nationalising the major corporations and banks in order to be able to begin to build a democratic, socialist, planned economy. We know that the right are doing all they can to make sure that Jeremy and his supporters are defeated. They're real counter-revolutionary defeatists. Because if May's forced to call a general election, they would rather have that general election thinking, perhaps wrongly, that Labour would be defeated because then they could get rid of Jeremy Corbyn. Because their worst nightmare is not a continuation of the Tories, it's a Jeremy Corbyn or a left-led Labour government. So we will do all we can to assist in the battle against the Blairites, whether it's inside or outside of the Labour Party. Our application of the expelled 75, including myself and others, to be allowed to rejoin the Labour Party is an indication of our willingness to take part in that fight against the right. And we call on the Labour left to fight for our right to join the Labour Party. Apparently, I didn't hear it, but on the Andrew Marr show this morning, Jeremy Corbyn was actually asked, should Peter Taff and the other leaders of what was the militant be allowed to join the Labour Party? And he answered by saying, well, if they're not members of prescribed organisations, yes, they should be allowed to join. If they are, no. And it's for the NEC to decide what a prescribed organisation is. Our answer to that is the whole method of prescribed organisations was set up as part of the witch hunt against the militant. Fight to get rid of it and for every socialist and socialist organisation to be allowed to take part in the Labour Party, not just for individuals, but more broadly, to open up Labour to all those who want to fight austerity, with a return to the kind of federal roots of the Labour Party, with different parties allowed to affiliate, as in fact the Co-op Party on the right is still able to do today. Now we know that some will answer to that. You're welcome to join the Labour Party, provided that you dissolve. You get rid of the Socialist Party, you renounce your ideas, you leave your Trotskyism outside. Our answer is that if we were to do that, it would be a political crime. A crime because of the role that we are able to play in the battle against the Blairites. Let's be clear, there are hundreds of thousands of people who helped put Corbyn back in power who would like to see their MP, if they're one of the 172, deselected. But we are the only organised force that is fighting for the immediate introduction of mandatory reselection, the only ones who say what needs to be said and do what needs to be done. But we would also add that the Labour Party is a very important front in the class struggle at the moment. It's two parties in one, and there is the possibility of creating a workers' party out of it. But it is not the only front in the class struggle, and we have a very important role to play elsewhere as well. Battling against evictions, as has been described by Nancy. arguing successfully for a national demonstration in defence of the NHS, as Zoe talked about. And now we need to fight to turn that into a massive demonstration which can be a launchpad for strike action in defence of the NHS. And fighting against the horrendous council cuts that are destroying local communities. Supporting workers like the Durham teaching assistants having to strike against a 23% pay cut by a Labour council. Many comrades here will know we are part of the trade unionist and socialist coalition, TUSC, alongside the RMT and others, which has a proud record of standing in elections against all of the pro-austerity parties. We have proposed in the Socialist Party, and it's being discussed by TUSC, that in England and Wales there is a pause in our standing in elections in order to allow a discussion on how Labour can be transformed into an anti-austerity party. But there is no pause in us opposing council cuts, no pause in us demanding that Labour councillors promise, pledge and candidates pledge to vote against cuts if they are re-elected, and no pause, of course, in supporting workers and community activists who are fighting back against those cuts by whatever means, by striking, by demonstrating, by occupying, and also, by the way, by standing in elections. This hasn't come up, but if the Durham teaching assistants were to say that they wanted to oppose the county council's continuation of cuts by standing, not only us, but any decent anti-austerity activist should support them in taking that stance. And an essential part of the struggle to transform the Labour Party has to be a discussion on a strategy to fight local councils, to change them from being bastions of implementing austerity to being bastions of fighting it instead. It is not viable that Labour can continue until 2020 claiming to be opposed to austerity, even if Jeremy stays in power, if at the same time every Labour council is implementing austerity up and down the country. And we have to build a movement. Oh, sort of clapping there. And we have to build a movement against the local council cuts and demand that that is part of the struggle to transform the Labour Party. Now, there are too many other campaigns for me to mention in which the Socialist Party is playing a vital role, not least because Ian keeps passing me notes saying, please stop now. So I'm just going to finish with one final point, which is the role of the Socialist Party and of the Committee for Workers' International is not most what we're doing now. The work we're all striving, the struggles we're involved in are very important, but our most important role will come in the future. Capitalism is in crisis. Worldwide and in Britain, anger against the existing order is growing. People are drawing socialist conclusions, but the millions, the majority of the population who are angry, are not yet drawing conscious socialist conclusions. But as they enter struggle against the capitalist system, that can change very quickly on the basis of their experience, but also of our intervention arguing for a socialist programme. The 20th century was a century of heroic, but ultimately unsuccessful, struggles against capitalism and for socialism. Working class people fought to change society, but ultimately were defeated by the betrayals of their leadership. In the 21st century, we have the possibility and the duty to do things differently. There are going to be opportunities to break with capitalism and to build a new socialist order based not on profit, but on meeting the needs of humanity and saving our planet. That is what we are preparing for, those mighty struggles, and why I would say to all of you, if you're not yet a member of the Socialist Party, join us because of what we're doing today, but even more, join us because of the struggle for socialism that will develop in the coming period.